Welcome to First Beliefs, the podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient wisdom, spiritual traditions, and sacred knowledge that human beings have lived by, passed down, and returned to across thousands of years of searching for meaning in a world that does not always offer easy answers. Whether you have come here tonight to discover something new, to sit quietly with questions that matter, or simply to let the unhurried voice of deep history carry you toward rest, you are exactly where you need to be. Here, we do not rush, we move at the pace of reflection. We sit with ideas the way a person sits with a candle in a quiet room, still, attentive, allowing the light to reach into the corners at its own speed. Tonight, we are going to explore why human beings pray. Consider for a moment what it means that prayer appears everywhere. In the frozen landscapes of the far north, where our ancient ancestors whispered words to the wind before a hunt. In the temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where priests rose before dawn to address their gods with the careful precision of people who understood the stakes. In mountain monasteries and riverside shrines, in hospital rooms and kitchen tables, in moments of extraordinary grief, and in moments of ordinary morning quiet. Across every continent, every century, every civilization that history has recorded, and almost certainly across the deep, unwritten millennia before that, human beings have prayed. That is not a coincidence of culture. It is something that seems to rise again and again from the architecture of the human mind itself. And that fact alone deserves our full attention. Across our time together tonight, we will follow that question through 5 remarkable territories. We will begin with the oldest impulse, sitting with the sheer universality of prayer and asking what it tells us about the nature of human consciousness that every known culture has engaged in some form of it. From there, we will travel back to the deep prehistoric past, to stone and fire and the first evidence of ritual behavior, and ask when the human reach toward the unseen began and what it looked like before it had a name. Then we will turn inward and look at what prayer actually does to the mind and body of the person praying, what neuroscience, psychology, and the lived testimony of practitioners across traditions have to say about its measurable effects on human well-being. We will explore prayer in its communal forms, the extraordinary power of voices and intentions gathered together, and what shared prayer has meant to human communities across time. And finally, we will sit with a quietly remarkable fact that in an age of scientific understanding, distraction, and widespread secularization, prayer has not disappeared. It persists in forms both traditional and improvised among people of every background and belief, and we will ask what that persistence reveals about something deep and perhaps irreducible in what we are. This is a long and contemplative journey. Let your breathing slow. Let the silence around you become an asset rather than an absence. And if at any point the deep, unhurried rhythm of these ideas draws you gently into sleep, that is not a failure. That is, in its own way, a kind of surrender to stillness that prayer has always understood. But before we begin, one quiet request. If this podcast brings you something of value tonight, a new perspective, a moment of genuine peace, A question that lingers with you into the morning. Please take a moment right now to subscribe to First Beliefs on YouTube. Leave a comment below telling us what drew you to this episode or which ancient tradition or spiritual question you would most like to explore in the future. Your voice shapes this community, and every comment is genuinely read and considered. If this episode speaks to you, share it with someone in your life who asks the kind of questions that prayer asks. Questions about what we are reaching toward when we reach, about whether anyone or anything is listening, about what it means to be a small and conscious creature in a very large and mostly silent universe. Every subscriber, every like, every share helps this space grow and helps these conversations find the people who need them now. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us ask the oldest question. Why do we pray? Part 1. The oldest impulse. In quiet rooms and open fields, in temples and beside hospital beds, humans have whispered words into the silence. They have pressed their palms together, lifted their faces toward the sky, bowed low to the ground, and traced patterns in the air with trembling fingers. They have done this in the cold darkness of winter mornings, in the golden haze of summer evenings, and in the terrible stillness that follows grief. They have done it alone, and they have done it together, their voices rising in unison like something ancient and uncontainable. Across every continent, across every century that history has recorded, and almost certainly across the unwritten millennia before that, human beings have prayed. That single observation is worth sitting with for a moment. No matter how different two cultures might be in their language, their architecture, their food, their music, or their understanding of the cosmos, the act of prayer appears among them both. It surfaces in the frozen landscapes of the far north, where indigenous peoples once offered words to the spirit of the wind before a hunt. It appears in the river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, where priests recited long invocations to gods whose names are now only known to scholars. It is found in the stone temples of Egypt, in the mountain monasteries of Tibet, in the small and ordinary kitchens of families who pause before a meal to say a few words of gratitude. Prayer, in other words, is not an accident of one culture or one faith. It is something that appears to emerge again and again from the human mind itself. This raises a question that is less about religion and more about psychology and perhaps even about biology. Why? Why do humans do this? What need does it serve? What does it feel like to pray, and what does it do to the mind and body of the person who is praying? And what does the sheer universality of this behavior tell us about the nature of human consciousness? These are the questions this episode will explore gently, without rushing, and without claiming to know more than can honestly be known. The goal is not to argue for or against any spiritual tradition. It is simply to look carefully and curiously at one of the most widespread and deeply rooted habits of the human species. To begin, it helps to go back, far back to a time before written language, before organized religion as we understand it today, before temples or scriptures or formal clergy. Archaeologists studying prehistoric human behavior have long observed evidence suggesting that early humans engaged in ritual activity. Burial sites tens of thousands of years old show signs of careful arrangement, the presence of flowers, tools, ochre painted bones. These actions suggest an inner life that extended beyond the purely practical. They suggest that human beings were already, in the deepest past, doing something that points toward prayer, reaching towards something unseen, performing acts of meaning in the face of mystery. The anthropologist Walter Burkert, who studied the origins of human religious behavior, described religion and ritual as an ancient response to the experience of being alive in a world that is vast, unpredictable, and often threatening. When a person or a community faces something they cannot control, something overwhelming or incomprehensible, the mind reaches for something beyond itself. It seeks contact, communication, or at least acknowledgement from a force or presence that seems larger than ordinary human life. Prayer, in its most essential form, may be precisely this reaching. It is the gesture of a conscious mind encountering its own smallness and choosing not to fall silent but to speak. The earliest prayers we have written evidence of are extraordinarily old. In ancient Sumer, in the region that is now Iraq, scribes inscribed hymns and prayers onto clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago. These texts were addressed to gods and goddesses who governed the forces of nature, the crops, the rivers, the movements of celestial bodies. The language of these prayers is often surprisingly intimate. There is pleading in them and gratitude and a kind of tender familiarity. The people who composed them were not speaking into a void. They were speaking to someone or something that they believed could hear them and respond. This quality of intimate address, the sense of speaking to a presence rather than merely into the air, appears across nearly all prayer traditions throughout history. It is one of the most psychologically significant features of prayer, and it connects the ancient Sumerian scribe to the person who today folds their hands before sleep and speaks quietly into the dark. Something in the human mind seems to need to be heard. Part 2: Stone, Fire, and First Words. To understand how prayer developed across the ancient world, it helps to move slowly through a few of the earliest civilizations where prayer took on structured and recognizable forms. Ancient Egypt offers one of the richest early windows into organized prayer life. For more than 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization maintained a vast and intricate relationship with a world of divine powers. The gods were not distant or abstract. They were woven into every aspect of life, into the flooding of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the moment of death, the growing of grain. The temples that dotted the Egyptian landscape were not merely places of worship in a modern sense. They were understood to be the literal homes of the gods, and the prayers offered within them were acts of practical maintenance, keeping the divine forces of the world in proper relationship with human life. Priests in Egyptian temples rose before dawn and performed elaborate morning rituals, opening the inner sanctuaries, presenting offerings of food and cloth and perfume, and reciting hymns that had been refined over centuries. These prayers were not improvised. They were precise, carefully memorized, and believed to be effective only when performed correctly. The words mattered. The order mattered. Even the tone of voice mattered. For ordinary Egyptian people, prayer was more personal and less ceremonial. Archaeological discoveries at sites like Deir el Medina, a village of craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, have revealed small votive stelae, which are inscribed stones on which ordinary people recorded prayers for healing, for forgiveness, for the safe return of a loved one from a journey. These small stones are deeply moving in their specificity. They are evidence of real people in real difficulty, turning to something beyond themselves with real hope. Far to the east, in the ancient Iranian plateau, another tradition of prayer was taking shape. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religious traditions, developed a rich practice of prayer that centered on the concept of fire as a symbol of truth and divine light. The prayers known as the Gathas, which are among the oldest surviving religious texts in any language, are attributed to the prophet Zarathustra, and they are remarkable for their philosophical depth and their personal searching quality. They are not simply requests or praises. They are, in a sense, conversations, meditations addressed to the divine with an earnestness that feels surprisingly modern. Zoroastrian prayers were tied to specific times of day, with practitioners ideally pausing to pray 5 times across the waking hours. This structure of prayer at set intervals, rooting the spiritual life within the rhythm of time, would appear independently in multiple traditions around the world, suggesting that there is something psychologically meaningful about punctuating daily life with moments of deliberate attention. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, a tradition was developing that would become one of the most elaborate and philosophically sophisticated prayer cultures in all of human history. The Vedic tradition, which gave rise to what is today known as Hinduism, recognized prayer not merely as communication but as vibration, as sound itself carrying sacred power. The concept of the mantra, a word or phrase repeated with focus and intention, rests on the idea that certain sounds, spoken or chanted in particular ways, have an effect on both the practitioner and the world around them. The Sanskrit word mantra is sometimes translated as a tool of the mind, and this translation is illuminating. A mantra is not simply something said. It is something used, a cognitive instrument that shapes the attention, calms the nervous system, and draws the mind toward a specific quality of awareness. The practice of repeating a mantra, of returning again and again to the same syllables in a rhythmic and meditative way, produces effects on the human mind and body that modern neuroscience has only recently begun to document with precision. We will return to that science shortly, but for now, it is worth pausing to notice something that all of these early traditions share. In ancient Egypt, in early Iran, in Vedic India, and in the temples of Mesopotamia, prayer was understood to be something that works. It was not merely an expression of feeling. It was an act, a practice with consequences. The person who prayed was doing something, not simply feeling something. And the structure of prayer, the repetition, the specific times, the careful words, the bodily postures was designed to produce a result in the relationship between the human and the divine, yes, but also, unmistakably, in the state of the human being themselves. This is where the psychological story of prayer begins to come into focus. Part 3. What prayer does to the mind. There is a remarkable consistency in what people across cultures and centuries have described as the experience of prayer. Whatever their theology, whatever their tradition, they tend to describe certain common effects: a quieting of the internal noise, a sense of being accompanied rather than alone, a release of something carried too tightly, a softening of fear, a return of something that might be called hope. These descriptions are not merely poetic. They correspond to measurable changes in the brain and body. In recent decades, researchers in the fields of neuroscience and psychology have turned their attention to contemplative and prayerful states with increasing seriousness. What they have found is both fascinating and, in some ways, deeply unsurprising. When a person engages in focused, repetitive prayer or chanting, such as the kind found in the rosary practice of Roman Catholic Christianity, in the repetition of mantras in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, or in the structured recitation of verses in Islamic prayer, the brain undergoes a shift. Activity in the regions associated with self-referential thinking, what researchers sometimes call the default mode network, tends to quiet down. The amygdala, which plays a central role in processing fear and stress, shows reduced activation. The parasympathetic nervous system, which governs the body's rest and recovery state, becomes more active. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens. Cortisol levels, a primary marker of physiological stress, begin to decline. In short, the body moves from a state of alertness and vigilance toward a state of calm. This is not a trivial finding. Human beings are, by nature, prone to anxiety. The same cognitive capacities that allow us to plan for the future, to learn from the past, and to imagine possibilities also make us extraordinarily good at anticipating threat, at replaying painful memories, and at generating worry about things that have not yet happened and may never happen. The mind, left to its own devices in an idle moment, does not reliably drift toward peace. It tends to drift toward unresolved problems, toward fears, toward the heavy ledger of things that have gone wrong or might go wrong. Prayer, in many of its forms, offers the mind something specific to do. It gives attention a resting place. Instead of chasing its own anxious spirals, the mind is invited to settle, to focus, to repeat, to listen. The effect is similar, in some neurological ways, to certain forms of meditation, and this comparison is not coincidental. Many of the practices we today call meditation grew directly out of contemplative prayer traditions, and the distinction between the two is often less clear than it might appear. The psychologist Kenneth Pargament, who has spent much of his career studying what he calls religious coping, identified prayer as one of the most widely used and consistently effective psychological resources that humans draw upon in times of distress. In study after study across different faith traditions and demographic groups, people who engage in prayer during periods of stress, illness, grief, or uncertainty reported higher levels of emotional resilience, lower levels of depression, and a greater sense of meaning in their experience. They did not necessarily report that their circumstances improved, but they reported feeling less alone in them and more capable of continuing. Parliament was careful to distinguish between different styles of prayer and their different effects. A prayer of genuine surrender, what he described as a collaborative relationship with the divine, tended to produce greater well-being than prayers characterized primarily by demand or desperation. The person who prayed not merely to receive something but to be in relationship with something beyond themselves seemed to benefit most, psychologically speaking. This echoes something that contemplatives across traditions have said for centuries, that the deepest prayer is not about asking, but about opening. Not about filling, but about releasing. In Islamic spiritual thought, the practice of salah, the 5 daily prayers, is understood not only as a religious obligation, but as a regular return to a state of awareness, a pause in the flow of ordinary life that reorients the practitioner toward what matters most. The physical postures of Islamic prayer, the standing, bowing, prostrating, and sitting, are not incidental. They involve the body fully in the act of prayer, engaging breath, movement, and attention together. Researchers who have studied the physiological effects of this practice have noted similarities to gentle exercise and structured breathing techniques, both of which are independently known to reduce physiological markers of stress. Buddhist chanting, practiced in traditions ranging from Tibetan Buddhism to Zen and Theravada, similarly engages the body and the breath in a way that produces measurable calm. The repetition of specific verses or syllables over extended periods draws the wandering mind back, gently and repeatedly, to a single point of focus. The effect over time is a gradual training of attention, a quieting of habitual mental noise, and what practitioners describe as an opening into a quality of awareness that feels spacious, clear, and restful. Christian contemplative prayer, particularly in traditions such as Lectio Divina and the practice known as centering prayer, invites a similar quality of receptive attention. The practitioner is not asked to think carefully or argue skillfully. They are asked to be still, to listen, to allow the mind to soften around a word or phrase, and to rest in the experience of presence. Across all of these traditions, the structure of prayer seems designed to do something very specific to the human nervous system. It interrupts the default mode of anxious self-preoccupation. It offers the mind a rhythm and a focus. It engages the body in ways that reinforce the shift toward calm. And it places the individual within a framework of meaning that is larger than their immediate circumstances. This is one of the great psychological gifts of prayer, whatever one believes about its ultimate nature. It provides a way of relocating the self within a larger story. Part 4. Together and Alone. There is an important distinction in the word of prayer that deserves careful attention because it speaks to two quite different but equally significant aspects of human need. The distinction is between solitary prayer and communal prayer, between the private word spoken in darkness and the collective voice rising in a shared space. Both are ancient. Both appear across virtually every prayer tradition in human history, and both serve psychological functions that are real, documented, and deeply revealing of what human beings need in order to feel whole. Solitary prayer is, in many ways, the more intimate of the two. It is the prayer that happens without audience, without structure, often without prepared words. It is the prayer that comes when a person is alone with something too large or too painful to carry without acknowledgement. It is the whispered plea in a hospital corridor. It is the gratitude murmured before a window filled with morning light. It is the long, unspeaking stillness of a person sitting with their grief, choosing to be present to it in the company of something they cannot see. Psychologists who study the function of self-disclosure, the act of putting overwhelming experience into words, have found that the simple act of articulating something difficult produces measurable relief. James Pennebaker, whose landmark research on expressive writing demonstrated that giving form to painful experience through language reduces both psychological distress and certain physiological markers of stress, suggested that the mechanism at work is fundamentally about coherence. When we can find words for what we are feeling, the experience becomes, in some neurological sense, more manageable. The inchoate, pressing weight of emotion begins to take shape, and what takes shape can be held. Solitary prayer, in this light, may function as a form of structured self-disclosure with a crucial and psychologically significant addition, the sense of a listener. The person who prays alone is not simply talking to themselves, or at least they do not experience it that way. They are speaking to a presence, whether they conceive of that presence in explicitly religious terms or in something more private and less defined. And the experience of being heard, even by a presence that cannot be empirically verified, appears to carry real psychological weight. The sense of being heard is, after all, one of the most fundamental human needs. It is what infants seek from caregivers. It is what patients most often identify as central to their experience of being helped. It is what people in grief need most, not advice or explanation, but the simple and irreplaceable gift of being listened to without judgment. Prayer, in this sense, may be one of the most ancient and reliable sources of that experience. Communal prayer tells a different but equally important story. When human beings pray together, something happens that is distinct from what happens in private. The shared rhythm of chanted words, the collective bowing of heads, the simultaneous movement of bodies through familiar ritual, these create what psychologists call a sense of synchrony, a feeling of being aligned with others that is deeply soothing to the social brain. The humans are profoundly social animals. The experience of isolation, of being cut off from the rhythms and presences of others, is not merely uncomfortable. For extended periods, it is genuinely damaging to health. Research on social isolation has found that it increases risk of depression, cognitive decline, and even certain physiological illnesses by magnitudes that make it one of the more serious threats to human well-being. The body and brain are oriented at the most fundamental level toward connection. Communal prayer satisfies this need in a way that is both ancient and efficient. It gathers bodies into shared space. It synchronizes breath and voice and movement. It creates a felt sense of belonging to something larger than the individual. And it does all of this while simultaneously addressing the deeper existential concerns that prayer has always served. The great cathedral choirs of medieval Europe, the call and response of West African prayer traditions, the vast and beautifully coordinated movements of millions of Muslims in prayer during the pilgrimage to Mecca, the melodic chanting of monks in Tibetan monasteries, the spontaneous harmonies of gospel congregations, all of these are communal prayer in forms that are as different as music itself can be, and yet all of them serve the same underlying function. They tell the individual, you are not alone, you are part of something, your voice belongs here. The ritual dimension of communal prayer is also worth examining on its own terms. Ritual. The behavioral psychologist Christine Lagarde has argued, serves a crucial cognitive function in times of uncertainty. When outcomes cannot be controlled, ritual behavior, even when its connection to those outcomes is symbolic rather than causal, provides a sense of agency and order. The act of performing a known sequence of actions, the familiar words, the familiar movements, the familiar smell of incense, or the familiar sound of a bell, restores a sense of predictability and structure to a mind that is overwhelmed by what it cannot predict or control. This may explain why prayer so reliably intensifies at moments of crisis, before battle, before surgery, during illness, in the face of natural disaster. It is not that people in these moments suddenly become more religious than usual. It is that the human mind, confronted with the limits of its own power, reaches for a form of ordered action that reestablishes some sense of structure and meaning. The ritual of prayer says, even here, even now, there is a shape to things, there is something to do, there is a way to be. This is prayer functioning not as theology, but as architecture. It builds a structure inside the mind when the external world has lost its reliable form. Part 5. The Quiet Persistence. There is one final thread to follow, and it may be the most quietly remarkable of all. Prayer has not disappeared. Despite centuries of secularization in many parts of the world, despite the rise of scientific understanding that has explained away many of the phenomena that ancient peoples attributed to divine action, despite the gradual erosion of formal religious participation in numerous Western societies, the act of prayer persists. Studies conducted across multiple countries and decades consistently find that significant majorities of people, even many who do not identify with any formal religion, report praying at least occasionally. In surveys conducted in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across Europe, researchers have found that somewhere between 40 and 90% of respondents, depending on the country and the precise definition used, report engaging in some form of prayer. Perhaps more surprising, a meaningful portion of those who describe themselves as non-religious or as uncertain about the existence of a divine being also report praying, sometimes regularly. What are these people doing when they pray? What do they believe they are communicating with or toward? The answers are varied and often hard to categorize. Some describe a sense of speaking to the universe, to something greater than themselves without a specific name or form. Some describe it as a kind of deep and focused thinking, a way of clarifying their own values and intentions. Some describe it as comfort, a habitual returning to a feeling of being held that they cannot fully explain but are unwilling to abandon. Some describe it as gratitude, a practice of acknowledging what they have been given, even without a clear sense of who gave it. What unites these varied descriptions is the quality of attention they involve. Prayer, whether formal or improvised, religious or secular in character, involves a deliberate turning of the mind towards something that matters. It involves a quality of focused sincerity that ordinary thought rarely achieves. And it involves almost always a moment of stepping outside the relentless self-concern of ordinary cognitive life and acknowledging something beyond it. The philosopher Simone Weil described attention as the rarest and purest form of generosity. In prayer, attention is what is given and perhaps what is received. The person who prays becomes, for however brief a time, genuinely present to themselves, to their experience, and to whatever it is they are reaching toward. This quality of presence, of genuine attentiveness, may be at the heart of why prayer persists. In an age of constant stimulation and distraction, in a world where the attention is pulled in 1,000 directions simultaneously, and where silence has become almost a luxury, the act of prayer offers something that few other practices can match. It offers a moment of deliberate stillness, a space in which the inner life can be heard, a temporary release from the performance of ordinary life, and an entry into something more honest and more quiet. Children, before they are taught any specific theology, naturally develop what developmental psychologists call intuitive religiosity. They ask questions about where things come from, about what happens after death, about whether the universe has intentions. They talk to imaginary presences with the ease of people who find it entirely natural to address the unseen. This tendency, which appears across cultures and developmental contexts, suggests that some of the cognitive architecture underlying prayer is deeply embedded in human development, not a product of cultural transmission alone, but something that emerges from the way the human mind is structured. The cognitive scientist Pascal Boyer, studying the origins of religious thought, has argued that the human brain has a strong tendency to perceive agency in the world, to interpret ambiguous events as intentional, to sense presence where there may be none, and to attribute meaning to coincidence. This tendency, sometimes described as a form of hyperactive agent detection, would have had survival value in the ancient environment. The creature that hears a rustle in the grass and assumes it might be a predator survives more often than the one that dismisses it. And the same cognitive tendency that kept our ancestors alive may also lie in part at the root of prayer. The sense of a presence, the impulse to communicate with something larger, the feeling that the universe is, in some sense, listening. These may be partly the product of a mind built to perceive agency everywhere. But to explain the origin of an impulse is not to diminish it. The fact that the capacity for prayer may be rooted in particular features of human cognition does not make the experience of prayer less real to the person who prays, nor does it fully account for the profound and documented effects that prayer has on human well-being. However it arose, and whatever its ultimate nature, prayer does something. It has always done something. That is why it has survived. As the long human story has moved through the centuries, the forms of prayer have changed. The clay tablets of ancient Sumer have given way to small screens and whispered words before sleep. The temple priests of ancient Egypt no longer rise before dawn to open the sanctuary of a god. The precise Zoroastrian fire prayers of 3,000 years ago are practiced today by a small but devoted community keeping an ancient flame alive. Hindu mantras that were once transmitted only orally between teachers and students now appear in recordings that can be listened to anywhere on earth. The chanting of Buddhist monks continues in monasteries from Japan to France to California. And in countless ordinary homes and hospital rooms and quiet corners of the world, people who may not know the name of any prayer tradition at all still, in moments of need or gratitude or wonder, speak quietly into the silence and reach for something they cannot fully name. The act of prayer, in its deepest form, is an acknowledgement of the limits of the self. It is the moment in which a human being puts down, at least temporarily, the project of managing everything alone. It is the gesture of a finite mind encountering the infinite and choosing, against all odds, to speak. Closing reflection. There is a quality to silence that prayer has always known. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something present and unhurried. The silence of a room after words have been spoken. The silence that follows the last note of a long and beautiful chant. The silence in which perhaps the most important listening takes place. Throughout the long history of our species, across every geography and every century, human beings have created this silence for themselves. They have set aside the noise of ordinary life, stepped out of the current of daily urgency, and turned their attention towards something larger than themselves. They have done it in languages no longer spoken, in temples long since returned to dust, in practices whose origins stretch back before memory. And they have done it, somehow, in ways that left them calmer, more connected, more capable of continuing. Not always, not in every instance, but consistently enough, across enough lives and enough centuries, that the behavior has never stopped. What that means, finally, is something each person must sit with in their own way. Perhaps it means that the human mind is built for something beyond purely material life. Perhaps it means only that we are social animals who need to feel heard. Perhaps it means that focused, intentional attention is itself a kind of medicine, and that prayer has always been, among its other things, a very old and very effective way of administering it. Or perhaps the most honest thing that can be said is simply this: across all of human history, in all of its diversity and contradiction and beauty, people have prayed. They have reached beyond themselves into the uncertain air. They have spoken their fears and their gratitude and their deepest hopes to something they could not see but could somehow feel. And in the reaching, something in them has been eased. Whatever the explanation, that is a remarkable thing about us, a thing worth knowing, a thing worth sitting with quietly as the day grows still and the night comes gently in. Thank you for being with First Beliefs tonight. Rest well.